Dutch court says Shell must reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by the year 2030.
In the age of global warming hysteria, companies are now under enormous pressure to become carbon neutral. This means that they have to come up with creative and sometimes nearly illegal means to offset their carbon emissions. So the question is, are we actually making progress toward our global goal of net zero emissions? Well, yes, some of us are. But what goes on at the other side of the net zero market is so disturbing that you might hate big companies forever. Before we get into it, make sure you like this video. Also, subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on some exciting new videos. Let's get into it.
We issued $5.75 billion in sustainability bonds, the largest by any company in history.
But environmental groups are really skeptical. They argue that offsetting now would simply be a way for the wealthy to avoid or delay taking the necessary steps to reduce their use of fossil fuels.
We start from the beginning to get a better understanding. Carbon dioxide is a gas in our air, hanging out with nitrogen, oxygen, and a bunch of other gases. It keeps heat locked inside the Earth. Too much of it causes problems like heat waves and floods. It's produced by the Earth naturally. But whenever humans burn fossil fuels, the total carbon in the air increases. This is where the very important process of decarbonization comes in. Decarbonization involves cutting down on carbon in the atmosphere, typically by shifting to cleaner energy sources and materials that produce less carbon. This move away from high-carbon fossil fuels helps combat climate change. To prevent long-term global warming and its devastating effects, we are expected to limit the increase in greenhouse gases. These actions fall under the umbrella of decarbonization, and many companies, nations, and groups have committed to transitioning to net zero emissions in the near future. While sectors like power, oil, gas, and transportation are often singled out as major contributors, every industry must contribute to achieving net zero. In response to this need, the concept of carbon offsets is now popping up everywhere these days. It used to be mostly airlines and the suits dealing with them, but now there are these companies selling offsets left and right. They're saying that regular folks and big organizations in wealthy countries can fight climate change with just a simple click. What these companies do is that they buy credits from projects that stash away carbon, often in less fortunate parts of the world. So some of these projects are all about planting trees. Others are like, hey, we'll pay you not to chop down your trees. And then there are the ones that go all in, investing in tech like renewable energy and trapping gas from landfills. But the common thread is that by tossing a bit of cash their way, regular people can offset the emissions they produce and score a point for the planet. But you know, isn't it weird how easy and cheap it is to get these carbon credits? It's almost like it doesn't match the whole climate crisis situation, right? Lately, some people have been getting a bit worried that this whole offsetting thing is just a quick eco-fix. Some critics are even saying it's a bit of a scam, giving polluters a free pass without doing much for the planet. The truth is that they might be right. If you've ever dug into the world of voluntary carbon markets, you might have come across names like Verra, Gold Standard, or maybe even the American Carbon Registry. If you're already familiar with these organizations and their roles, you might be a bit skeptical. But if not, here's a quick rundown. The voluntary carbon market is growing faster than a bamboo shoot after rain. Demand for carbon credits could skyrocket by up to 15 times by 2030, and possibly a whopping 100 times by 2050. In plain terms, we could be looking at a carbon credit market worth over $50 billion in 2030. That's a huge pile of cash that could potentially go haywire. Historically, the carbon market has had its share of problems, from misleading claims to outright shenanigans, like companies deliberately creating excessive amounts of harmful refrigerants just to profit from their destruction. So it's clear that this market needs some serious oversight. Think about the early days of the stock market. It's kind of like a parallel. Before the big crash in 1929, there wasn't much oversight, and that led to a ton of frauds and scams. But as time went on, the market got more structure, thanks to public bodies like the SEC in the US and private rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's. This helped reduce fraud and make investments more consistent. In today's voluntary carbon market, companies like Verra and others play a similar role, but who put them in charge? Well, it's basically the buyers. Big companies buying carbon credits want assurance that what they're getting actually helps the planet. Because doing extensive research on every project is too time-consuming, they basically outsource this task to organizations like Verra. When someone buys a Verra or Gold Standard certified credit, they can reasonably trust that these projects meet a minimum quality standard and aren't outright scams. In January 2023, an investigation by European media outlets, including The Guardian and Die Zeit, found significant flaws in Verra's carbon offset program. The report revealed that over 90% of the company's rainforest offset credits may not genuinely reduce carbon emissions. Oh, what a surprise! After that report dropped, Verra, the big player in this $2 billion a year market, suddenly decided they'll toss the whole system out by 2025. They've got this amazingly different plan to stop the misuse, or so they say. You know, Verra's certification program, the one with those serious loopholes, is just the freshest scandal in the world of carbon offsets. It's only been around for 3 decades, but hey, who's counting? The concept, initially pushed by influential industries like big oil, steel makers, car manufacturers, and food companies, was always met with suspicion by environmental activists. This system, or lack thereof, has no checks and balances. It's practically begging for fraudulent claims to sail right through. So Shell, for instance, can now magically offset its North Sea oil well emissions by doing, well, anything in distant places like Burundi or Cambodia. They've accused these big corporations with mounting evidence of basically skirting the rules and being less than honest about carbon offsets and trading. All these companies need to do is prove they've allocated a portion of their budget to groups that plant trees, protect the environment, or pretty much anything that vaguely pass as eco-friendly. Big industry, being its usual self, has turned this into yet another way to make money, creating a kind of stock market for carbon trading. This lets a company with extra carbon credits sell them to a company that polluted more than they were allowed. For a company to get extra credits, it basically means they didn't pollute enough, or they bought credits from some distant place. That the entire carbon trading and offset system seems fishy has been clear to everyone except the regulators and businesses. Groups like Greenpeace have been slamming carbon trading and offsets for years, arguing that they just encourage polluters to keep on polluting. Environmental groups argue that governments are taking a backseat on the issue, pretending that carbon offsets actually achieve something. This means there are no real checks on the claims of billions of dollars being invested in carbon offset programs worldwide. The criticism of Verra's flawed certification program is just the beginning of the problems in the global carbon offset system. As the world races toward a climate crisis, governments can't ignore this issue any longer. Fraud is likely to increase as countries and companies rush to meet their carbon reduction commitments by 2030, as mandated by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The goal is to reduce global carbon emissions by nearly half by that time, but no country seems to be on track to achieve it. More and more companies and countries will surely be lining up to embrace the carbon offset system to demonstrate their eco-friendly intentions. Because why not? It's essentially a voluntary system, and we all know how much faith we can place in voluntary commitments, right? Wrong. With the vast sums of money changing hands to skyrocket in the years to come, it's an absolute magnet for all kinds of, let's say, creative activities. Who wouldn't want to jump into a game where trust is the name of the day? Rest assured, when those diligent regulators and auditors finally decide to take a peek, there will be a parade of skeletons dancing out of the closets. Governments really owe it to themselves and us, their citizens, to jump right in and either toss out the current system or whip up some kind of fancy framework with real, on-the-ground checks for these carbon offsets, instead of just relying on estimates or pieces of paper handed out by those oh-so-altruistic companies. The need for intervention has become even more pressing recently as various companies and groups have started asking consumers for contributions to reduce their carbon footprint, a system overseen by Verra. Today, it's common for airlines to ask travelers for a small, voluntary contribution to offset their flight emissions, or for clothing brands to claim their products are carbon neutral. In both cases, consumers are essentially asked to trust the company without much transparency. They barely have a clue, and as for them controlling where that cash goes, not a chance. This whole setup practically screams fraud with these restrictions, all while folks rush to play their part in the climate crusade. The world's governments should really pull their heads out of the sand and take a gander at this market. Maybe then they can rescue their citizens and the planet from getting duped. Because, what we truly need is to slash those carbon emissions, not some clever accounting tricks. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe for more. Where money matters, we'll see you on the next one.